I think we can get underway. Once again, thank you for joining us for our December webinar focused on the Database Migration Assistant. To take us through this topic is SQL Solutions Group founder and principal consultant, Randy Knight, also a Microsoft Certified Master. Thank you again for being here. So Randy, go ahead, take it away.
All right, well, it's great to be here. This is a little bit of an interesting webinar experience. I committed to doing this before I realized we were already going to be on our winter vacation. So I'm actually sitting in a cabin in Idaho. There appears to be pretty good internet here, so hopefully we'll be in good shape. But if there are any glitches, I apologize in advance. And we'll go ahead and get started. Just real quickly, you're likely familiar with SSG if you're on this webinar, but we're a Microsoft partner data platform. We have focused on solely the Microsoft data platform since the company was started 10 years ago. And of course, what the Microsoft data platform has expanded since then, right? That was just SQL Server. And now, of course, with the cloud, and a lot of the business intelligence things and so forth. But so we do a lot of cloud stuff, both Azure and AWS. But at the core of it, we're DBAs. So we do some BI things. We do some general cloud stuff. But by and large, we live and breathe SQL Server 24/7. We have a few different types of offerings. Consulting, just billable hours is pretty much our bread and butter, what we've done forever. We do also have a managed service called Remote DBA. If perhaps you're a shop without a DBA because you just don't have the need for a full-time person, or perhaps you need, as a DBA, you need to focus on core business deliverables and leave the routine DBA stuff to us. So. And then, of course, we do health checks, and we also have a coaching program, if you're interested in that, where you spend an hour or two a week with me, virtually, of course, and we go through and we look at and we work through issues or things that you're addressing in your environment. So as opposed to training, which tends to be very canned, this is, hands-on, applying what you learn to your specific environment. So I always heard years ago, if you're going to be in the cage with the lion, would you rather have a lion trainer or a zoology professor? And this is kind of that way, to be in the cage with the lion, meaning your environment and maybe your critical issues with a SQL Server expert with you. To help out. So enough of that, just a little bit about me. As Jason mentioned, I am a Microsoft Certified Master in SQL Server. I have been doing SQL Server exclusively since 1997. I've been in the IT industry, I guess another 10 years before that. So I've been doing SQL Server for a very long time, since version 6.5. Prior to starting SSG, I spent most recently 6 years as a database architect for Match.com, which of course it was an extremely interesting place to work and interesting data and interesting problems because we had, the SQL Server 2000 at that time. We served up about 50 million pages a day, all of which came from the database. So we were, scaling SQL Server and doing things with replication that really hadn't been done with that version, at least. Today, we're going to talk about migration, and we will be looking at the Microsoft Data Migration Assistant, which is a tool that Microsoft has provided that can be very helpful in migrations. But we'll be talking about migrations as a whole as well. So we'll start out by talking about migration types. We'll talk about what are some of the challenges that we could run into. Some do's and don'ts, best practices, things that we have found, as being a professional services company who does this, we've done hundreds of upgrades and migrations and consolidations, and that's some of the kind of work that people ask us to do, because you might upgrade your SQL servers or create an availability group or whatever it is, once every few years. We do it every day almost. We'll look at the data migration assistant and how we can use that to assess our environment and help understand what some of the issues might be as we migrate. And then we'll talk about next steps after this. Okay, types of migrations. The main one that we all do are just on-premise, right? Maybe it's a version upgrade. Last year, SQL Server 2008 R2 went end of support, or end of extended support actually, so it's completely unsupported by Microsoft at this point. And so there were lots of upgrades that needed to happen, and there are still lots of upgrades that need to happen. So going from your on-premise 2008 to 2017 or 2019, whatever the case may be. Could be consolidation. Perhaps you're building out a large cluster of SQL servers for SQL as a service type of thing, database as a service. In the virtualized world, we end up doing a lot of this work because in large environments, it makes sense. If you have a virtual environment, VMware or Hyper-V, and you license all of the cores, then you don't have to license anything on the actual VMs as far as SQL Server is concerned. So it can be very cost effective to build that kind of an environment. So new hardware, new infrastructure, maybe you're going to a new data center, and rather than lift and shift, you're going to migrate your databases. Whatever the case may be, we run into this as DBAs quite often. Or you could be migrating to the cloud. And what does that mean? Well, the cloud can be divided into kind of two different types of platforms. Infrastructure as a service, or IaaS, which is simply having a virtual machine in the public cloud. So in Azure or in AWS or in Google Cloud, whatever the case may be. But ultimately, it's a Windows server running on a virtual machine that you're going to install SQL Server on-premise on, right? So from a migration standpoint, migration from on-premise to on-premise versus on-premise to IaaS is pretty much the same thing, right? Because at the end of the day, it's a VM running a Windows operating system, running SQL Server, or it could be Linux, of course, now. So that's IaaS. The other platform is platform as a service. And these would be the serverless offerings that are not virtual machines that the vendors offer. So on the Microsoft side, it would be things like Azure SQL Database, Synapse Analytics, Power BI falls into this category because it's cloud-based. On the Amazon AWS side, they have what they call RDS, Relational Database Services, and they have many different database engines, as does Microsoft, SQL Server being one of those. So that kind of a migration is much more complex typically, because there's not necessarily feature parity between on-premise SQL Server and whatever you're going to in the cloud. So you need to really ensure that everything is going to work as expected. Okay, what are some of the challenges that we run into when migrating or planning a migration? And another way that I think of this is, what are some reasons that we postpone migrating? What are some reasons that we have 2008 R2 out there in production, which is, 4 versions behind? 2012, 2016, 2017, now we're on 2019, right? And people tend to really treat their databases with kid gloves, as they should, but really not want to upgrade because of the challenges associated with it. So many times the issue is, what do we have? We know we have this database server, that we need to upgrade, we need to migrate. We know these databases are on it. We know these logins are on it, but we don't necessarily know what all these databases are used for. What are the applications that connect to these databases? Where are the connection strings for those applications? Because if we move to a different server, we're going to have to address all that, right? So that's one of the areas that people are hesitant about. What's going to break? Every time we migrate a SQL Server, or people say this, you know, something breaks, right? And it's just so high risk, you know, so it's a risk reward situation, or cost benefit, maybe not seeing the benefit of it. A lot of these 2008 R2 upgrades are finally happening because of the lack of support. People are realizing, yeah, we really need to get off of this platform. And finally, a lot of this can all be wrapped up to fear that, you know, changing database servers, upgrading, migrating is a big deal. And because of all these issues that we're looking at before, people just don't want to do it. Okay, so you know you need to migrate. What are some best practices or things that you should do? Use the opportunity to clean up the environment. We all have servers out there that when they were originally set up, maybe they were set up by a vendor for an ISV application, or you know, just set up according to default, so they're not set up for best practices. Maybe things have happened over the years, like you know, we put some file shares out there, or there's some other services on the server. You know, there's jobs that are no longer necessary. There's databases that should be decommissioned, right? That's what happens in these environments. So what I'm saying here is this is a great opportunity to fix those things, to you know, create a pristine SQL Server environment built on best practices and migrate to that just what you're actually using. So security hardening is another opportunity there, right? In this new environment, if you have a situation where you have SQL servers where there's way too many people connecting as sysadmin, or even application logins have too many permissions, this is a great opportunity to address that. This should follow the pattern of all projects, big projects, from a standpoint of we need to do an analysis, then a design, then implement. You know, we can't just grab a copy of the latest version of SQL Server and throw a server out there and say, hey, let's move stuff there, or even worse, do an in-place upgrade on the existing server. We really need to identify all of the things. There's a term from years ago called WISCI, which is why isn't somebody coding yet? And this is used in software development circles to illustrate the lack of, you know, spending time on business requirements and technical specifications and making sure that we know what we're going to code. And when WISCI happens, what tends to happen is that we tend to code and recode and recode and recode as we figure out what the requirements are. So the same thing goes here. When you go to do your actual production go live migration, it should be very smooth. You should have identified, quite often we don't get to 100%, right? Because there's just so much out there. But you know, 99% of any issues you've addressed in testing and in your design before you go live. Evaluate the impact of this. In your analysis, you need to really understand the impact of making this change. And if you're dealing with internally developed applications, you should plan for your QA folks to do a full regression test of those applications in the new environment prior to making the production move. What are some don'ts, or worst practices might be a way to think of that? Don't install unnecessary components. One of the things we see often is a SQL Server was installed and someone was just going through the wizard, maybe didn't know what everything was, so just installed everything. And that's problematic in a couple of ways. One is it just expands the surface area of your SQL Server. And I think of the surface area for attack, right? If you're not using reporting services and an exploit comes along that exploits reporting services to get onto the server to get to your databases, don't install it, right? Also, when you come to times like this where we're talking about, hey, we don't know what's all being used, what's out there, and we look at this server and we see all those services on there, well, now that expands what we have to look at. Is reporting services being used? Is analysis services being used? What's going on here, right? So determine what you actually need and install just those components. We recommend against in-place upgrades. They're very attractive from a simplicity standpoint, that we just take our existing server and we execute the installer and we do an upgrade and we're on the new version. So we recommend against that for a couple of reasons. For one, everything we've talked about cleaning up the environment, you're really not taking the opportunity to do there. So you're potentially bringing along with you bugs or configuration issues or things that have caused issues in that environment in the past. But most importantly, you don't have a simple rollback path, right? If I have my old server and I go create a completely new environment and I migrate everything there, both for testing and for go live in a designed, planned, executed way, when it comes to make that go no go decision, if we decide, you know what, we have too many issues going on here and we need to roll back, all you have to do is point your applications back to the old server, right? Where if you do an in-place upgrade, best case, you're going to have, like a VM snapshot or a, bare metal backup or something like that you can roll back to, right? But you're not maintaining that environment as is. Don't move things in your MSDB, master, etc. by restoring system databases. It's much better to move objects that you have determined that you need. Let's talk about what those objects are. So databases are pretty straightforward, right? We have a database which consists of one or more data files and a log file. And we can detach that and move those files to where they need to go and attach them. We can back up the database and restore it. There's a variety of ways that we can accomplish that. But there's also many things at the instance level or the SQL Server level that we need to make sure are working and are migrated correctly in order for everything to work the way that it should. Logins, right? So just a quick review of SQL Server security. You have a login which gives you access to the instance, right? That's where the security takes place from a standpoint of authentication, whether it's SQL standard login or a Windows integrated login or something else. That happens at the instance level. Then there are users in the databases which are mapped to a login. So we have to get the logins along with the databases. Replication. Do we have replication enabled? Is this server a publisher and a subscriber or a distributor? And how are we going to do that? Are we going to move those databases? Are we going to, script out those publications? What if I have a very large publication that's transactional replication and maybe it's going a long distance and we don't want to have to re-push all that data? How are we going to manage that? Jobs. All of your SQL Server agent jobs need to be moved. If you have any triggers at the instance level, right? Things like logon triggers, you need to address those. Linked servers, maintenance plans. If you're using the Microsoft built-in maintenance plans, those would have to be migrated. Any credentials, certificates, database mail configuration. If you're using SQL Server auditing, those objects will have to be moved. If you're using things like always encrypted or transparent data encryption. You have encryption keys to think about, right? So there are lots of things that we have to address in a migration separate from just the databases. And in my experience, this is where people run into trouble, right? Either because of lack of knowledge or just because there's so many things to think about. And we tend to think in terms of databases. Okay, one of the other things that we have to really think about when migrating are SQL Server compatibility levels. Compatibility level is a database property that determines the version of Transact SQL you can use in that database. And the reason we have them is because if you have deprecated Transact SQL features or even features that have been removed in a new version, and you have code that uses those, you would want a lower compatibility level for that database so that your code works. Makes sense. The big thing to be aware of is that when you upgrade a database or restore a database, if you take a database from one version and you restore it to a different version, a higher version, the database compatibility level will not be changed automatically. Right? So if you have a database that you created in years and years ago in SQL Server 2000, its compatibility level is going to be 80 unless you change it, right? And what happens is that over the years we go through these upgrades, but we don't change the compatibility level. So we have things like SQL Server 2016 that has databases in 80 or 90, right? So that needs to be part of your plan as you are upgrading. But where it really comes in is take a look at that SQL Server 2000 level 80. On the far right, we have the supported compatibility levels for each instance, for each engine version. So I've got my SQL Server 2000 databases that are in 80, 2005, no problem, 2008, no problem, 2008 R2, no problem. But take a look at 2012. 80 is no longer supported in 2012. When you go to 2014, 90 is no longer supported. So Microsoft gives you plenty of opportunity to get these new versions in place and get your databases upgraded. But if you don't address the compatibility level, eventually you're going to run into a problem. And we have had a few customers with this issue that they have 2008 R2 instances that they need to upgrade because it's out of support. And we find databases in compatibility level 80, which we cannot move that database to a newer version without upgrading the compatibility level. So now the testing and the regression test and everything else for the code is even more important. So it's an important thing to have as part of your migration plan is managing compatibility levels. What are some of the gotchas that you run into, or the things that we find are cause the most issues when you do this? Objects in system databases. Best practice is to never create your own user objects in master, MSDB, model, right? Those databases should be fairly pristine in that they have just objects that have been created by SQL Server, right? Because it could even be in a DR situation, right? Where you restore your database to a different SQL Server, that master database doesn't have those objects, right? So that's an important thing to evaluate. And as we talked about cleaning up the environment, if you do have objects in your system databases, this is a great time to fix that. Database compatibility level we just talked about. We have had people who went all the way through, upgrading, putting the databases on the new server, and then when the database wouldn't work, we had to go through and explain how that works. So that's important. Deprecated feature usage. So as Microsoft enhances SQL Server, fixes bugs, adds new features, does different things over the years, certain features will be what is called deprecated. Deprecated does not mean removed. Deprecated features are still there in the engine, but by saying it's deprecated, Microsoft is saying, hey, we are going to remove this feature at some point, and you should no longer be using it, right? So we need to find deprecated features we're using. At some point, those features actually become removed features, and that becomes really critical to identify those, right? And then there are, I'm sure, many others that folks have run into. I would love if you have other examples of gotchas or things that happen, put those out there in the Q&A for this webinar, and we'll come back to that and address those at the end. Okay, that brings us to the Database Migration Assistant. The Database Migration Assistant is a tool that Microsoft has provided to assist us in migrating databases, evaluating the existing environment for all of these things is the primary benefit of this. It will do a migration itself, and that works for simple migrations. It's just going to do a backup and a restore. And if you have a lot of small databases that you need to migrate, that can be useful just from a time-saving standpoint. But if you have large databases, or if you're going to do things like set up log shipping from the old environment to the new because your databases are too large and it would be too long of an outage to do it all at once, you're going to use the Migration Assistant or the DMA to evaluate your environment and do an assessment so that you know what you have to address as you plan your migration. It looks at kind of two different things, or two categories. Compatibility issues, right? So are you doing things in your existing environment that won't work in the new one? And are there new features that you might benefit from? That's one of the coolest things about this, right? Is that even if everything's compatible, it may say, hey, here's this new feature in SQL Server 2019 or in Azure or whatever you're migrating to that would be really beneficial. You're doing it this way and you probably should go look at this. So that's pretty cool. The other one I don't have here on the slide, when you are migrating to a platform as a service like Azure SQL DB, it actually does some checks on what it's calling feature parity, which are there some on-premise features of the engine that are not supported in the cloud that you're using, because you're going to have to change that or have some sort of workaround. And then, of course, you can perform the migration for simple migrations. It only does the databases and logins. So all those instance level objects that need to be addressed are not included as part of the DMA. It's really focused on databases, migrating the database and making sure that you can connect to the database, which are logins, of course. All right, it's a download from Microsoft, and I've got a link here in the slides, or if you Google it, that's really easy to do as well. It's just called the Microsoft Database Migration Assistant, and it's a pretty simple install. When you go to install it, there's actually nothing that you have to decide. So you accept the terms of the license agreement, hit install, and it goes through and does its thing, and it's finished. And of course, it takes longer than that. That's why I recorded that as a short little video. Okay, so with that, let's take a look at the Data Migration Assistant. I'm going to switch over to it, and I've got a couple of different ones here. It takes a while to perform these assessments. So what we're going to do is kind of show how we set up the project, and I call it the cooking show technique, right? Where we switch over and, hey, here's how it comes out of the oven, right? Even though it had to roast for 2 hours. Okay, so when you start the Database Migration Assistant, you end up with this screen. The first thing you're going to do is create a project. So if I click that, it wants to know, is this an assessment or a migration? We're going to do an assessment, and we're going to call it a demo. And it's the database engine. The source is SQL Server. It can be SQL Server or RDS from Amazon. Not surprisingly, Microsoft has RDS as a source, but not a destination. because they're looking to get you to go to their cloud. The target can be Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL Database Managed Instances. Those are both platform as a service offerings. SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machine, which is an infrastructure as a service offering, or just an on-premise SQL Server, right? So we're going to just say on-premise, and we're going to go ahead and say create. And then it asks us, hey, what version of SQL Server are you targeting to move to? 2019 on Windows, 2019 on Linux, all the way back to 2012. So it has all the supported versions. The Linux and Windows is an interesting point because just as we talked about feature parity with the cloud versions and on-premise, there are some feature parity issues between Linux and Windows as well. There are features in the Windows version that aren't yet in Linux, although that gets better and better with each release. All right, and then we tell it, hey, what do we want to check for? Just compatibility issues, just new features, or both? We're going to go ahead and say both for this demo. Next, now it wants to know the source. So I'm just going to use my local computer here. It's got a few databases on it, so I'm going to say localhost if I could type. And I'm not going to worry about encryption or anything like that. Hit connect, and it shows me all of the databases that are on this server. I'm going to go ahead and select everything, and I'll hit add in a moment, but it also gives you a couple of other options that we're not going to look at today, but are useful to explore. You can, if you have a profile or trace or an extended event session that you've gathered on your source system, you can actually put that in here as part of the assessment, and the tool will look at that. You also have the same option for ad hoc query files that run against your databases. So obviously, the more information we give it, the better it's going to be at identifying issues that we might have. So I'll go ahead and click add. And we can see all of my databases. Now, my local instance is SQL 2019, and most of these databases were created there. So you see my compatibility level is 150 for almost all of them. 140 AdventureWorks 2019, because I've got that specifically set up that way. But this is just my local instance with a few things on it. There's not going to be much to do here. But what I do is I click and I say start assessment, and it starts cruising through doing the assessment, right? Well, let's go over to this version of the DMA. This is the same configuration. My local, you can see those databases are the same name, but this is with it completed. And I can go through database by database and see this report. So it will give me if there are deprecated features I'm using, informational, behavior changes. So anywhere that I've got full text, it tells me, hey, full text search has changed quite a bit. So you really need to dig into your options and settings and make sure that you know that it's going to work, or that's something to really focus on in your testing. There's a link here to give you more details on that, and it will tell you the objects that are impacted. Like, hey, you've got these 3 full text indexes that could potentially be impacted by this. Okay. All right. Here's a compatibility issue. Same thing on that one. Again, in this one, there's just not going to be much here because it's a pretty pristine demo environment. What I do have here, though, is a report from a system that we actually ran for a customer on a actual 2008 R2 server, which is compatibility level 100. There's the database information. Notice if I go back to my, sources here, let's see. I don't think I can. When you have your list of databases like we have in like we had in this one. We'll see, it's running now. Anyway, you can see the compatibility level of each of the databases at that time, which is useful, right? So we look at this database, MSP, it's 137 gig, it's in compatibility 100. And if you look at the tabs, now it's likely going to be the same issue for all of them because they all have one, but it's saying, hey, if you're staying in 100, here's your issues. If you're going to go to 110, here's your issue, and on up. The issue that is identified is that when the nvarchar max and nvar binary data types were implemented, text, ntext, and image were deprecated. So they still work, but Microsoft is saying at some point we're going to take those away, and what you should be using if you need text, which of course would be because you have a data type that's going to be over 8,000 characters for varchar or 4,000 characters for nvarchar, you need to use this blob data type, right? Well, you should be using the varchar max, nvarchar max, var binary, and nvar binary. Okay. So, and that's a change that you may or may not be able to make from a testing and implementation standpoint in your migration, but at least you know about it, right? As we go through some of these different databases, we're seeing the same thing there. Here in our product activation database, we've got some different ones. And notice we've got 3 all the way down to 2. So compatibility 100, which is what we're in now, they're saying, hey, if you leave the compatibility level the same, you're going to have these 2 issues, right? The deprecated data types is there. There's unqualified join syntax, right? The old style or non-ANSI style join, where you include the join criteria in the where clause, is something that we've been told for many years we should not do and is going away. It eventually has been deprecated to the point that using that can cause performance issues in your queries because the optimizer just isn't going to evaluate it correctly. So those joins need to go away. All right, as we go through these, you can see that this environment's actually in pretty good shape. We're not seeing different ones. There's more unqualified joins, data types. We don't have the full text one here because apparently they're not using full text. But that's the idea, is that it goes through your databases and it tells you, hey, here are the things at the database level that you need to address in order to have a successful migration. Okay, that's the database migration assistant. If we go back to the deck for this last little bit, next steps. So what we have talked about here today is primarily the assessment or planning for your migration, right? We're not performing the actual migration, and we'll talk here in just a moment about some of the different ways that you can do that. But what are some things that you need to do? So you've gone through your assessment, you've found all these things. If there are issues that DMA found, this is a great opportunity to fix those. You need to identify all of those server level objects that we talked about. Link servers, logins, SQL Server agent, jobs, operators, alerts, things like trace flags that you have turned on, right? And as you look at those, make sure that you evaluate your trace flags, because in many cases, there are trace flags that we needed in older versions that we no longer need. For example, and I don't remember the exact number, but there's a trace flag to tell TempDB to use uniform extent allocation. Well, that's now the default, I believe, starting in 2016. So that trace flag is redundant. Okay. All right, so you've identified everything. What are your options to actually perform this migration? Well, You can use the data migration assistant like we saw. It will move your logins for you, copy your logins. That's important from a standpoint of whichever option you choose. As you migrate logins, it's best to use a tool like Data Migration Assistant, or I believe there's even some built-in SSIS stuff with the to move databases. We are huge fans of the DBA Tools PowerShell module. That's a community-driven open source project for managing SQL Server using PowerShell, and it is fantastic. I can't say enough good about it. We do things that would have taken 2 hours and 10 minutes just by using those commandlets that are already out there. So that's also using SMO. So SQL Management Objects is the .NET library, I guess is the best way to put it, that you can use to do things with SQL Server programmatically. All these tools are going to use that. One of the things they do is when they copy logins, they copy the hash of the login over to the new server, which is something that you can't do easily just creating logins, right? So you don't have to know the passwords, which you may not for some of your logins, and it will set the password the same on the new instance. And B, it just saves you a lot of time. Okay. Your options for migrating natively are backup, restore, detach, attach, right? I suppose you could say you could create the database with an empty schema and export, import, but typically it's going to be one of these two approaches. Detach, attach being shut down the instance, detach the database, copy the files over, attach them to the new instance. Backup, restore being exactly what it sounds like. And then again, we really like DBA tools. This is just a quick screenshot. If you go to dbatoolsio, these are all the categories of tools that they have. And you'll notice that one of those categories is migration, I believe, and I'm not seeing it in this list. Let me just go to that website real quick. Do I have here's a browser. Go to dbatoolsio. And if I look at the list of commands, there's this whole set of commands for migration. And if you look at those, there are things like copy DBA agent alerts. That's going to copy all your SQL agent alerts from the old system to the new system. Job category, job, operators, proxies. That's another agent thing I didn't mention, but that's something that you need to make sure are in place. Schedules, right? So all of your SQL Server agent stuff. If you're using credentials at the instance level, you can copy the credentials. You can even copy the database using backup, restore, or attach, detach. Those are options for that commandlet. So if you look through this, almost everything that you need to do with those instance level objects is included here. And it's a very, it saves a lot of time and a lot of potential for user error using those tools. But whatever you do, you need to make sure that you test your migration. And many times this will be multiple tests, right? By the time you get to your production go live, you should have a scripted step-by-step plan for how you're going to execute this migration, right? You need to include applications in your testing. A lot of times it's DBAs doing these migrations, so they think like DBAs that, we need to make sure that we get these objects moved and make sure that the logins work and we're done. Well, that's not really the case if the applications don't work, right? So you need to include your application teams, make sure that those have been tested as well. And again, a full regression is the best thing that we could do. The last thing there, establish log shipping. So I mentioned that briefly earlier. This is a little bit of an advanced migration topic, I would guess. I guess. But the idea here is if I have an environment that I can't take a long outage to perform this migration, you know, if it's a business hours application that I can, you know, Friday after we close, I have until Monday morning when we open to perform my migration, great. But in many environments, you know, we have situations where even getting an hour of downtime is tough to do. And if I have large databases that I need to migrate, I can't do that in an hour. So typically what we'll do after we've done all our testing, we have our pristine new environment, we will establish log shipping between the old and the new, so that we're doing all that time consuming, restoring or copying and restoring the full backups happens while the old system is still alive. And then we're shipping logs. And when we actually go take our production outage, it can be very short because we take down the old system, we recover log shipping, so those databases have all the most recent transactions, and we bring up the new environment and we're good to go. Okay, that wraps up this webinar. I do see at least that there has been at least one question, so I'll go to the Q&A in just a moment. But just pointing out our future webinars, we're trying to do these once a month. So next month, January 13th, we're going to talk about best practices for backups, RPO, RTO, how not to jack up your log chain, right? So kind of the internals of backups and why that's important. And then in February, we're going to come back to migration and do migrating SQL Server using DBA tools. So we'll go through those commands and things that we were talking about and use those to migrate from an older version to a newer version. So, okay, Q&A. I'm gonna stop presenting here and switch over to my Microsoft Teams and take a look at the Q&A.
Click on Randy. Click on the published.
Yep, I see. All right. Okay, there's some good stuff here. All right. Okay, I see Jason posted the download link for the DMA. Okay, so VJ, restore with CDC and custom messages for app and master database are the issues I've faced recently. That's a great one. So in the sys messages table, if you can, you know, when you're using like raise error to generate an error message, you can actually create custom error messages that live in the master database sys messages table. So that's an important one. I'm going to add that to my list, VJ. That's a really good one. Change data capture. That's another great one. We talked about replication, but in that same category, change tracking, change data capture, those are all instance level things that there's stuff that lives at the instance level, there's stuff in the databases that we need to address. So, you know, let's see, and then the second question from VJ was, what is the max tracer extended event file we can upload to the database migration assistant? You know, I actually don't know the answer to that. But what I will do is I will find the answer to that, and maybe we'll do a follow-up like blog article or something talking about those files and using those with the DMA. So that's a great question. Jason, you can put that on my list for blogs that I need to write over the holidays.
Sounds good.
Okay, that's what I see here as far as questions. Thank you everyone for joining. I'll stick on here for a few more minutes if there's any additional questions. I noticed too that Jason did post a link to register for the January webinar. So if you're interested in that, please click on that. Hopefully there wasn't any glitches or things with the internet connection here. Appreciate your time, and I hope everyone has a great holiday season, whatever it is that you happen to celebrate, even if it's just time off work. And like I said, I'll stick around here for a few moments. Jason or Scott, since you were on the other end, did you notice how was the quality? video and all that?
It was good.
Okay, great.
It looked good.
We just had another one come through, Randy.
Okay. How does DMA work with backups that are taken with the Redgate backup tool? I've not tried that, but I would say it doesn't, right? So when you use the migration assistant to perform your actual migration, it actually does the backups itself. So it's not using your existing backups of any kind. It wants you to have a share that it can write to that's accessible to both instances, and it does a backup to that share and a restore on the other. So good question. But what this comes down to is, like I said, for simple migrations, using the DMA for that is great. But most of the time for more involved stuff, like I've got backups from Redgate that I want to use, right? Well, that's okay. As you're in your plan, you're going to restore your backups using your Redgate tool. So great question.
Good.
The other thing that I would say is if later on, maybe you're playing with this or you're doing your own migration, you have questions, things that come up, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to answer an email. If it gets, super involved that we're helping you do it, then, we'll talk about an engagement. But as far as just email, quick questions, please feel free to reach out to me via email, Twitter, LinkedIn, whatever channel makes sense for you.
All right, I think we probably covered it today.
All right, well, we'll go ahead and drop off. And thank you everyone for joining, and hope that you found this useful.